Chapter 8, Religion and Temperament. All right. It seems best at this point to turn back for a moment from ethics to psychology, where a very important problem awaits us, a problem to which the exponents of the perennial philosophy have given a great deal of attention. What precisely is the relation between individual constitution and temperament on the one hand, and the kind and degree of spiritual knowledge on the other? There's quite a bit here. All right. Huxley spends a great deal of time going over body types and mental dispositions and preferences of being a thinker, a doer, or someone who interacts a lot with other people. And you can read all about that and get into it if you'd like, but that is not necessarily the main focus, other than to say that almost to each his own, and start where you are and to what you are naturally gifted to do. And so, on the bottom of 148, in Hindu thought, the outlines of this completer and more adequate classification are clearly indicated. The ways leading to the delivering union with God are not two, but three: the way of works, the way of knowledge, and the way of devotion. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna instructs Arjuna in all three paths: liberation through action without attachment, which would be the way of works; liberation through knowledge of the self and the absolute ground of all being, with which it is identical, which would be knowledge, internal study; and liberation through intense devotion to the personal God or the divine incarnation, or through people, through devotion. To these three types, there's action or works, knowledge, internal study to look within, and devotion is kind of like a combination of the two. Working with others, interacting with others, doing things with people, for people. So let's see here. Boy, a lot of this gets to be pretty, it's good, it's useful, read it, but it's not necessary for the understanding of what this is all about. So just letting others be who they are, what they're doing, why they're doing it, do that. Keep in mind what our ultimate goal is, so that actions are done without attachment. Spirituality is approached without self-love of ego, intellect, and work for others is done without regard for self. Each in his own way. I'm at the top of page 152. Each in his own way. This is the viscerotonic and the somatotonic, and that would be the somatotonics are the very aggressives. The viscerotonics are those who just thrive being around people and being the very charismatic. But the other, each in his own way, these are well adapted to the world they live in. But the introverted cerebrotonic, the one who is more inclined to be internal, is in some sort incommensurable with the things and people and institutions that surround him. Consequently, a remarkably high proportion of extreme cerebrotonics fail to make good as normal citizens and average pillars of society. But if many fail, many also become abnormal on the high side of the average: universities, monasteries, research laboratories, etc., wherever sheltered conditions are provided. And their regard is high, realizing the importance of this extreme, somewhat over-evolved, over-reflective scarcely viable type of human being, all civilizations have provided in one way or another for its protection. So, the path of devotion is the path naturally followed by the person to whom being social is a high component. His inborn tendency to externalize the emotions he spontaneously feels in regards to persons can be disciplined and canalized, so that a merely animal gregariousness and a merely human kindliness become transformed into charity, devotion to the personal God and universal goodwill and compassion towards all sentient beings. The path of works is for those whose extroversions is on the somatotonic kind, the competitive, the aggressive, the great. Those who in all circumstances feel the need to do something. In the unregenerate somatotonic, this craving for action is always associated with aggressiveness, self-assertion, and the lust for power. For the born, Kshatriya, or warrior ruler, the task, as Krishna explains to Arjuna, is to get rid of those fatal accompaniments to the love of action and to work without regard to the fruits of work, in a state of complete non-attachment to self, which is, of course, like everything else, a good deal easier said than done. Finally, the way of knowledge through the modification of consciousness, until it ceases to be ego-centered and becomes centered in and united with the divine ground. This is the way to which the extreme cerebrotonic is naturally drawn. His special discipline consists in the mortification of his innate tendency towards introversion for its own sake, towards thought and imagination and self-analysis as ends in themselves, rather than as means towards the ultimate transcendence of fantasy and discursive reasoning in the timeless act of pure intellectual intuition. So, that's the main gist of what that's all about. The Sanskrit Dharma, one of the key words in Indian formulations of perennial philosophy, has two principal meanings. The Dharma of an individual is, first of all, his essential nature, the intrinsic law of his being and development, but Dharma also signifies the law of righteousness and piety. The implications of this double meaning are clear. A man's duty, how he ought to live, what he ought to believe, and what he ought to do about his beliefs, these things are conditioned by his essential nature, his constitution and temperament. Going a good deal further than do the Catholics with their doctrine of vocations, the Indians admit the right of individuals with different dharmas to worship different aspects or conceptions of the divine. This is very key. Let them be who they are and progress from there. So hence, the total absence among Hindus and Buddhists of bloody persecutions, religious wars, and proselytizing imperialisms. It should, however, be remarked that within its own ecclesiastical fold, Catholicism has been almost as tolerant as his own and Mahayana Buddhism, within certain parameters, I guess. Nominally one, each of these religious consists, in fact, of a number of very different religions covering the whole gamut of thought and behavior and fetishism, through polytheism, through legalistic monotheism, through devotion to the sacred humanity of the avatar, to the profession of the perennial philosophy and the practice of a purely spiritual religion that seeks the unitive knowledge of the absolute Godhead. These tolerated religions within a religion are not, of course, regarded as equally valuable or equally true. To worship polytheistically may be one's dharma. Nevertheless, the fact remains that man's final end is the unitive knowledge of the Godhead. And all historical formulations of the perennial philosophy are agreed that every human being ought, and perhaps in some way or other actually will, achieve that end. All souls, writes Father Garrigou Lagrange, receive a general remote call to the mystical life. And if all were faithful in avoiding as they should, not merely mortal, but venial sins, if they were, each according to his condition, docile to the Holy Ghost, or to the Spirit, or to inspiration, and if they lived long enough, a day would come when they would receive the proximate and efficacious vocation to a high perfection and to the mystical life properly so called, when they're ready. With this statement, Hindu and Buddhist theologians would probably agree, but they would add that every soul will in fact eventually attain this high perfection. All are called, but in any given generation few are chosen, because few choose themselves. Moreover, there will always be helpers, for periodically there are descents of the Godhead into physical form, and at all times there are future Buddhas ready, on the threshold of reunion with the intelligible light, to renounce the bliss of immediate liberation in order to return as saviors and teachers, again and again, into the world of suffering and time and evil, until at last every sentient being shall have been delivered into eternity. So don't remain fixed. There's hope yet. All right, true, each of them comes naturally to persons of a certain kind of constitution and temperament, these ways of doing it, but the dharma or duty of any given individual is not to remain complacently fixed in the imperfect religion that happens to suit him. It is rather to transcend it, not by impossibly denying the modes of thought, behavior, and feeling that are natural to him, but by making use of them, so that by means of nature he may pass beyond nature. Thus the introvert uses discrimination, in the Indian phrase, and so learns to distinguish the mental activities of the ego from the principal consciousness of the self, capital, which is akin to or identical with the divine ground. The emotional extrovert learns to, in other words, give up his selfish attachments to the pleasures of indiscriminately loving and being loved, concentrates his devotion on the personal or incarnate aspect of God, and comes at last to love the absolute Godhead by an act no longer of feeling, but of will illuminated by knowledge and experience. And finally, there's that other kind of extrovert whose concern is not with the pleasures of giving or receiving affection, but with the satisfaction of his lust for power over things, events, and persons. Yeah, we know that. Using his own nature to transcend his own nature, he must follow the path laid down in the Bhagavad Gita for the bewildered Arjuna, the path of work without attachment to the fruits of work, the path of what Saint Francois de Sales calls holy indifference, the path that leads through the forgetting of self to the discovery of the self. All right, and so where are we now? Yeah. So these are reasons and warnings for this, and why is this so important, right? Let's get into that in a second.